Good morning. I am so honored and happy and inspired to be here with all of you today. Service is a long tradition in my family, and that is really how I'm here today. It started with my mom, who was very passionate about civil rights, and she always told us with pride how she marched on Washington with Dr. Martin Luther King, and that always inspired me my entire childhood up through my adulthood. She worked on something called Helpline, which was the Norman Vincent Peale hotline for suicide prevention in New York City. And she would come home to us after 3 hours in New York, telling us how that day she had literally talked a man off of a ledge and saved his life. In my own experience, I started in college doing something with the Phillips Brooks House organization at Harvard, where we visited elderly people who didn't have anyone to talk to. And I got to visit this incredible woman, Susie Cox, who lived near Cambridge. She was 100 years old when I met her. Her father had been a slave until he was 9 years old. She was one of the most inspirational people I've ever met, and she said that she was still trying to decide every day when she woke up if man's nature was essentially good or evil, but she was optimistic. And she was another true inspiration to me. After that, I volunteered for something called World Teach, which was an organization which sent volunteer teachers to China. That all kind of changed when Tiananmen Square occurred, and my focus went back to acting, and I became a professional actress. But in my 30s, Amnesty International came to me and asked me if I would like to be their Stop Violence Against Women campaign spokesperson. I was very honored. I said yes. And under that umbrella, I learned about human trafficking, and I started to meet survivors. And those survivors changed my life. Their intense courage, but the absolute horror of the experience that they had been through left an indelible mark on me and made me realize I had to commit my life on one plane to helping end this atrocity. So the UN kind of got word of what I was doing as an activist, and they asked me to be their goodwill ambassador to combat human trafficking for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which is a position I've held since 2009. A volunteer position, it's volunteer work. So we're all here to do what else, if not to serve? If we can make other people's lives better, then surely we must try and do that. As a Christian, but also simply as a citizen of planet Earth, I feel this as deeply as anything I know. Now, one of the great blights on the history of humanity, which we believed blissfully had been eradicated, has reared its horrible head once more. Slavery is back among us. It has taken a more insidious, secretive form than in the past. It's subterranean, illegal, but no less horrific for its victims, who number greater than 29 million people worldwide. And currently, out of those 29 million people, only 1%, according to our State Department ambassador, Louis C. DeBaca, currently have a real chance of being discovered and rescued. 1 in 100 of those slaves will get to be a free person again. Victims that their traffickers see as commodities. I interviewed a human trafficker in Spain for 3 hours who had trafficked over 3,000 young girls and women to Spain as prostitutes. And he said to me, well, the women are like objects. They're like this glass. And he picked up a glass. He said they're commercial objects, mercantile objects to be traded. We don't care about their feelings. We just threaten them and their families, and they work for us by force. And when, I asked what did he have to do to keep people in line, he said, well, I'm not really the bad guy, but sometimes an example has to be made, and he went like that. He's cut girls' fingers off. He had actually also burned a girl alive, but that was another story. Victims like a little girl that I met in a shelter in Mexico City, largely staffed by volunteers as well, who was this tall. And she was 7 years old, and she had been brought to the shelter after being rescued from a Cancun brothel that served mostly spring breakers. And she had been there since the age of 4. She had been dropped off there by relatives, and she had no idea what she was doing. She could not even describe it. She just used the term incorrectos, incorrect, wrong. But there she was, and she was showing me her homework, her addition and subtraction, and she was missing some of her front teeth. And for the life of me, I could only see my daughter standing there in front of me. You know, I have 4 children, and my oldest is 9, my youngest is 2, and it's like a fate worse than death for a mother to think of their child put through these kind of horrors, and yet that is what is happening to millions of children around the world today. And not only sex trafficking. I don't want you all to just come away with this feeling horror for sex trafficking, because labor trafficking is equally horrific, and women and girls in labor trafficking are also raped all the time. So they're both horrendous and both need to be fought with equal vigor. A Nigerian woman I met who had been trafficked into Spain had been tricked and told that she was going to get a great job in Spain, and when she got there, after a very crazy passage in a cargo container on a ship, was told, you owe us 30,000 euros. We have your baby. If you don't comply with our every demand and pay us on time, no questions asked, we are going to kill your child. And if she had any complaints, she would talk to them on the phone, or if she was late on a payment, they would beat the child on the phone for her to hear. This is very common among traffickers. This wasn't like an extremely cruel trafficker. This is what they do. This is how they elicit the free labor, is they terrify their victims, and they make them feel that they don't have the capacity to leave without harm to themselves or their families. There was a Filipino man in California whom I met recently, who came in thinking he was going to work in construction and ended up working in an elder care facility as traffic labor. He had 6 months straight work, 7 days a week, no days off. He was made to sleep at the side of the beds of the elderly patients that he was taking care of. He had no medical training, by the way. And he and the other woman that was trafficked with him were forced to eat scraps from the garbage. They weren't allowed to use the showers. They were just degraded in every possible way, as well as being unpaid for labor and told that they were in a debt bondage situation to this woman who brought them over for 10 years. So it's all around us. This was in Long Beach, California. I actually thought for a second it might have been the facility where my husband's grandmother spent her last few months. I mean, it's all around us. Trafficking and modern-day slavery is everywhere. We just don't see it. We don't think to look for it. So here's where our worlds collide, mine and all of yours. You see, I think that if you're already of the mind and heart to give your time to make others better off, then your empathy cannot help but to be ignited against modern-day slavery. You're all already natural-born abolitionists. You just may not have realized it yet. But I know you'll not tolerate the destruction of lives, the wrenching apart of families, the abuse of little bodies to the point of death, venereal disease, or the final destination for some children who cannot work at sex or labor trafficking anymore, and that is the harvesting of their organs. I'm sorry, I know that's very, very disturbing, but it's true. This is what's happening out there, and everyone needs to know this, and it's growing. These markets are growing and growing. Your hearts are too open, they're too big not to let all these people in. Now all we need to do is harness your empathy and your outrage. If you will not tolerate slavery and actively fight it, it will end in our lifetime. Survivors, yeah. No, I want you all to be lit today. I want a fire to light in all of you. This is not something we can kind of let other people do. Whatever you're doing now, just add abolitionism to it, because it's all part of the same effort, because none of us can tolerate the idea that our brothers and sisters are living in bondage, are not allowed to live free lives. You know, I know why the caged bird sings was so apt. When I heard that, I was kind of like, this is a sign, you know? All of these survivors that are discovered, they need your special skills to help them climb back out into the light of day, to regain their lives again. Victims need your eyes and ears to catch the telltale sign of their exploitation, because they will not generally be able to self-identify due to what one police chief called the ties and binds, the chains you cannot see. They're so psychologically under sway that even if they have the physical freedom to walk from one place to another, they're not going to use that freedom generally to walk into a police office and say, help me, I'm a trafficking victim. They need you to call the National Human Trafficking Resource Center at 1-888-373-7888, or text info or help to Be Free. Groups that are lobbying to change the laws of the land, not only on the federal level, but more crucially on the local one where it really affects people, need your man and woman power to make sure that the government understands that putting traffickers out of business is the mandate of the people in this and every country of the world. But I can tell you this pretty much with absolute certainty, it's not going to stop unless we make it stop. The profits north of $32 billion a year are too great. The risks for traffickers thus far too low, and the supply of economically desperate people who can be victimized nearly limitless. For although it trails only drug smuggling for the most lucrative criminal enterprise, in 1 month, the US government spends more on the war on drugs than it has ever spent from the first penny to this day on fighting modern slavery, both at home and abroad. 1 year's budget for US anti-trafficking initiatives is a few hours in the drug war. Why? Is it because the victims are the marginalized, beaten down, sometimes ill-educated, born into disadvantage, and sometimes whole-scale historical debt as a village, as a caste? Because they are children, often from broken or abusive homes. That's one of the greatest precursors to being vulnerable to trafficking, especially in this country, is to come from abuse. Or beaten women and raped, as I said before, whether sex or labor trafficked, female victims bear the brunt of frequent sexual violence. Or men desperate to earn money for their families, now desperate to stay alive. I think of my grandfather coming over on the boat from Naples and working in sweatshops as a teenager, but surviving that and getting to go to adulthood and become a working member of our society. That is not possible for these people who think they're making a better life for their families and then get caught in a hell of slavery. Governments and the average person don't seem to hear their cries. Survivors have recently come to the table as their own best advocates, but their numbers are still small. How is it that the trade in humans, some of them kept in cages, some forced to sleep with hundreds of commercial sex clients a week, some thrown off fishing boats in front of their comrades, murdered for insubordination, why don't they merit more of our time and our government's funding? Here we are in the South. I'm not sure if I can call this the Deep South, but maybe I can. Is this the Deep South? It's the South, okay. Are we really going to let slavery roll back in? Drowning in its wake our runaway daughters, our homeless or mistreated foster children, our hopeful immigrants trying to make a better life. Are we? What do you think? Locally, here in Atlanta, there is much you can do with your passion and your unique abilities. There are several excellent organizations such as Tapestry that serves foreign victims of violence, including trafficking, or Youth Spark, fighting commercial sexual exploitation of minors, and several more which you can find on the Polaris Project website, which is a resource for people looking to network with organizations working on this cause across the country. They could use your talents, your energy, your commitment. Organizations that work with survivors have a great need for people with legal expertise, for instance. Often the first contact made by a victim or a survivor is to help a service group for legal help. Counseling, tutoring, accompaniment on medical or court visits, all of these are needs you might be able to fill. If you want to travel, international organizations such as Agape International Missions, AIM in Phnom Penh, whose beautiful work was featured in the CNN documentary I did, Every Day in Cambodia, on the sale of young girls, the sale of their virginity. That organization literally runs on the fuel of volunteerism. They have visiting college students that rotate through, that do incredible work with these young kids. If you want to support their work from the States, you can volunteer for 3 Strands, which seeks to provide sustainable outlets for the products created by former trafficking victims that AIM serves. The possibilities are endless. Also on Polaris's website and on Shared Hope International's website, you can find state ratings charts, which tell you exactly where Georgia or your home state lands on its anti-trafficking legislation. One gaping need here in Georgia and in more than 35 states is the passage of a robust safe harbor law, which is a bundle of legislation that decriminalizes the child or minor in commercial sexual exploitation, providing him or her with crucially needed access to services, the ability for crime victim restitution or civil remedy, expungement of any criminal records, and the highest possible penalties levied upon their traffickers. The statutes of limitations for civil and criminal actions for child sex trafficking are eliminated or lengthened to allow sufficient time for successful cases. These victims have been so extremely traumatized as youth, they deserve every chance. Now, why is this legislation so important for you to support and pass? Because, and hear me very clearly on this point, there is no such thing as a child prostitute. Under the UN's Palermo Protocol that the US and over 100 other countries are signatory to, and our federal anti-trafficking laws, a child or minor under the age of 18 does not have the legal, developmental, or psychological capacity to consent to their own sexual exploitation. Minors, and this is explicit in Georgia law as well, do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion to be deemed trafficking victims. All kids in commercial sex, and this includes prostitution, stripping, and pornography, are crime victims, whether they are aware of that or not, or think they have given consent. They don't have that legal capacity. And we and the law have to view them as crime victims, not perpetrators. The old lens was to see them as perpetrators of the juvenile crime of prostitution. Now, we have a new enlightened way of seeing them as being exploited and abused and the victim of a crime, the crime at the hands of the pimp trafficker and the John. Therefore, it's crucially important that kids in the life stop being picked up by law enforcement, who are sometimes very well-meaning, arrested and put through criminal court proceedings, whether juvenile or adult. They are not the criminals, they're the victims of the pimps and the Johns. The safe harbor laws seek to rectify this long-standing law and order response to CSEC, commercial sexual exploitation of children, to decriminalize and refer the victims immediately into services, not through the court system, but straight to services, helping them rebuild their lives, expunging the records that could destroy their chances of higher education, a good job, and a positive self-image. I met a brilliant young woman who had been a trafficking victim, had gotten out, had educated herself, graduated from college, and had 3 interviews at a prestigious Washington firm. And on the 3rd interview, they ran a criminal background check, and they found the prostitution arrest on her record, and that was it. Interviews were over. There was no chance of her moving forward at that job, even though she was perfectly qualified and they loved her, because of that record, which was unfairly on her because it wasn't her crime. It was someone else's crime that was committed against her. Robust safe harbor laws get states to include child sex trafficking as a form of child abuse and neglect, which generally, amazingly, is not the case. Most states do not see human trafficking as a form of child abuse or neglect. And they can also assign putatively the pimp trafficker the role of abusive custodian, so that these minors are given all the services any other abused and neglected minor is due. They also need specialized shelters and services due to the specific trauma they've been through and their sensitivity to peer condemnation, not detention, normal group homes, or jail. Everyone here can go home and find a way to support local efforts to get these laws written and voted through. Although safe harbor legislation was introduced in Georgia this year, it did not pass. It is vitally, vitally important to our youth that the next one does, because sadly, the FBI ranks Atlanta as one of the 14 worst US cities in terms of child sex trafficking. The Georgia Demand Study reports that 7,200 men account for 8,700 paid sex acts with adolescent females each month, about 300 a day in Georgia. Though only 10% were openly purchasing underage sex, upon being warned thrice that the girl was underage, 47% still wished to complete the transaction. 42%, the majority of the buyers, were found in the North Metro Atlanta area. 34% were under 30, 44% 30 to 39, and 22% 40 plus. People, you can help here. Help to innovate and educate the men around you that purchasing commercial sex is contributing to creating greater and greater demand for trafficked teenage girls and boys, whose average age is between 12 to 14. That seeming consent is a legal and mental impossibility at that age. It is institutionalized rape. You can lobby for law enforcement to more stiffly penalize the buyers, Johns, who up until now generally are sent home from the scene of the crime by the police with the, go home to your wife and kids, we don't want to ruin your life. And then the girl is arrested. Can you imagine that? The married man with a family with possibly a daughter his own age gets off scot-free, and the child's life is scarred forever by this arrest. A recent study on habitual Johns polled said that they would stop buying sex if their car was impounded, if a letter was sent home, or if they were put on the sex offenders registry. Let's name and shame, let's do that. But more importantly, let's raise sons who honor their sisters and uplift them. rather than degrading them by renting their exploited bodies. It's time for men to be heroes in this arena, not perpetrators of a destructive practice of degradation and abuse that affects even our youngest girls and boys. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm running out of time, but I also want you to actively think about what you're buying and how your inquiries at point of sale could leverage big businesses into stamping out slavery in their labor supply chains. Up until now, the profit motive has led the day, companies contracting to third-party contractors who offer the lowest bids based on factories full of slave laborers. But the consumer can make informed choices that websites such as knowthechain.org can help them with. If we demand that companies enforce their zero-tolerance policy for slavery in their supply chains, and they have independent outside auditors, and this is kind of key because self-vetting really isn't enough. Really, there needs to be established a body of outside auditors who go to the big businesses and really do a thorough outside investigation. But if we reward them with our business, if they are clean, while boycotting goods with murky slavery footprints, our economic pressure will goad them into better practices that respect the human rights of their workers and put sweatshop owners out of business. Ladies and gentlemen, let's be creative, let's be passionate, let's work together, but above all, let's end slavery in our time. Thank you.